In film, narrative point of view is the organization of meaning through a combination of various levels of narration. The choice of which narrative point of view from which to tell the story alters the audience's perception of the diegesis, as well as their emotional involvement, making this a valuable tool for creating comparisons between themes. Both Isao Takahata's 1989 Japanese animation, Grave of the Fireflies, and Guillermo del Toro's 2006 Spanish-American dark fantasy film, Pan's Labyrinth, use narrative points of view to compare the innocence of childhood with the violence of war. These films were chosen for the historical, political, and social parallels that can be drawn between them. Pan's Labyrinth is set in Spain during 1944, 5 years after the Spanish Civil War, in which fascist forces were working to crush the remainder of the rebellion. Similarly, Grave of the Fireflies is set in Japan during the final months of World War II. These geographical and historical contexts mean that the films are linked by the violence of war. This is evident in Del Toro's portrayal of fascist cruelty and brutality, as well as Takahata's use of warlike iconography, such as the airplanes which soar through the screen, the bombs which fall from the sky, and the suffering of those below. Additionally, because these films were made more than 40 years after their respective wars, they were also shaped by social climates of national introspection. This involved questioning of the cost of war and of the extent to which innocence was lost as a result of violence. Due to the position of children as some of the most vulnerable members of society, they serve as a representation of this innocence, and thus the contexts of both films are reflected by the synthesis of child and adult narrative perspectives. Del Toro is known for his explorations into the interplays between the innocence of childhood and violence. Pan's Labyrinth supports this as it focuses on Ophelia, a young girl who travels with her mother to meet Captain Vidal, her abusive stepfather. Del Toro weaves a world which is heavily entangled between fantasy and reality, as Ophelia becomes embroiled in a magical quest given to her by a faun. Likewise, Grave of the Fireflies follows teenage Seita and his toddler sister Setsuko's struggle for survival in the face of great violence. Takahata juxtaposes this with the joy and fantasy which the children experience in spite of their hardship. This is typical of Studio Ghibli films, which often center around the use of fantasy to cope with difficult realities. The perspective which both Takahata and Del Toro use for majority of their films is a limited third-person point of view, centered around the children. This is used to create grounds for contrast of innocence against the violence of war. In Grave of the Fireflies, this is established at the very beginning of the film, when the ghost of Seita begins the narration of the story. His ghost watches his former body lying on the floor of a train station, battered and bruised by the ravages of war. Immediately, the audience knows that the film will be told through his eyes, as it is his voice that we hear. Similarly, in Pan's Labyrinth, the first shot shows Ophelia bleeding on the floor. By zooming in to an extreme close-up of her eye as the narration launches into an exploration of the fantasy world, Del Toro tells us that we're entering her perspective and therefore her story. In both films, the children are the first and last characters that we see, and this child's narrative point of view reinforces the idea that Grave of the Fireflies and Pan's Labyrinth are ultimately stories about the nature of innocence. To further explore this child's narrative point of view, Del Toro and Takahata use fantasy to navigate through the extremes of violence. Their mediums, animation and live action with special effects, lend themselves to the exploration of serious issues because they allow for the creation of fantastical creatures upon which to ground a harsh reality. In Grave of the Fireflies, fantasy takes the form of the procession of fireflies that temporarily dispels the darkness of Seita and Setsuko's lives. Allowing them to escape to hopes that their father survived the war. Later in the film, this fantasy returns in the form of the ghosts of the children, who remain together beyond the grave, watching over modern-day Kobe. In Pan's Labyrinth, fantasy also functions as an escape from reality. This is observed through the way that Ophelia slips away from Vidal's cruelty into the magical realm. The point of contrast here is that while it is safe to say that fantasy is a facet of both directors' uses of a child's narrative point of view, Del Toro takes it a step further by giving it equal credibility to reality. Takahata never allows fantasy to subsume the despair and violence of the film. We know that Seita's longing for his father is a figment of his imagination made of nothing but fireflies, and that ultimately the children do not escape the violence and apathy of the world. This is evidenced by Takahata's use of binary opposition to divide the world of fantasy from reality through color, such as in this shot, where the darker, warmer-toned pinks and reds separate Seita and Setsuko from the brighter and more colorful citizens of modern Japan. Del Toro also uses color to distinguish the fantasy world from the human realm. However, unlike Takahata, he doesn't let this separate them. Although majority of the fantasy world features a palette of bright reds and golds, and majority of Humanities' world is filled with dark blues and blacks, this isn't a rule which is always followed. When Ophelia talks to the faun, the palette features the same blues and blacks from when Vidal runs through the forest, despite this being supposedly a fantastical beast. Furthermore, seamless transitions guide us between the magical and non-magical realms through vertical and horizontal wipes. We see this when Del Toro uses a tree to wipe between a scene where the soldiers are traveling through the woods to a scene of Ophelia's adventures in the fantasy world. This occurs again in an upward swipe as we move from Ophelia in the bathroom to Ophelia in the labyrinth. These transitions create a sense of proximity between both worlds, which suggests they're intertwined with one another. Neither is made to seem more real than the other, as Del Toro provides just as much credibility to Ophelia's narrative point of view as he does to other adult perspectives. Another point of comparison between Grave of the Fireflies and Pan's Labyrinth is the use of adult sensibilities. Although we primarily follow the children, both directors sparingly use an omniscient narrative point of view to reveal things that the children might not understand. In Grave of the Fireflies, this privileged view is featured at both the beginning and end of the film. In this wide-angle shot of Seita in the train station, the high angle provides the audience with an extra layer of clarity that Seita cannot see. It emphasizes the connection between the way in which people quite literally dodge his suffering and the modern world, suggesting that our apathy is partially to blame. Similarly, at the end of the film, Takahata uses an extreme wide shot of Setsuko and Seita gazing over modern-day Kobe. The difference in color between the two halves of the frame create binary opposition between the individuals and the collective. Through this, Takahata emphasizes how a generation fell through the cracks in Japan's memory, and points an accusatory finger at those below, who live amongst the glittering lights of modern-day Japan. Where the child's narrative perspective fails to reveal the guilt which should accompany apathy, Takahata uses the omniscient perspective to explicitly point it out. In Pan's Labyrinth, this omniscient perspective comes at the end of the film. Although Del Toro already used this scene of Ophelia bleeding, we see it again through a high-angle wide shot, providing us with a privileged perspective. It allows us to notice the adults looming over her, and thus we can make the connection between adult violence and the suffering of children. However, the films differ in that Del Toro uses the omniscient perspective to lend credibility to the fantasy world. At the end of Pan's Labyrinth, an animated flower, which has functioned as the symbol of immortality throughout the film, continues to grow on the branch of a tree. The voice of the faun tells us that Ophelia continues to live on in the fairy tale realm.
Y se dice que la princesa descendió al reino de su padre.
It presents a seemingly objective point of view that would contradict the notion that the magical realm is simply a machination of Ophelia's imagination. Overall, Pan's Labyrinth and Grave of the Fireflies portray innocence and violence as opposites through narrative points of view. Fantasy, as part of the child's narrative perspective, sets up this comparison by acting as the escape in which innocence can flourish. Omniscient perspectives are used to ground this fantasy by entwining it with reality, providing adult sensibilities and reinforcing common themes within both films, such as how violence can cause the destruction of childhood innocence. These films differ, however, on the degree of credibility which these omniscient perspectives provide to the child's narrative point of view, with Del Toro giving them equal credibility and Takahata using omniscient perspectives as a reality check.